We are going to get to our comic book turning point story, and it is Fatal Attractions. 1993's Fatal Attraction. Let me go ahead and bring it up because I accidentally closed out the window. Um, this guy came out in 1993. This was before the deep late 90s, before the comic book industry just took a crap. This was when the covers, the gimmick covers that they did, um, were actually cool. They had holographic covers for each of the ones that came out. And it is most notably known as the storyline where Magneto tears out Wolverine's adamantium. Now, the reason why I picked this as a turning point storyline because it goes into a lot. I mean, it led to the evolution of Wolverine's character, realizing that his claws were natural and they weren't something that Department H added because at that time all of his memories were still jumbled. So he had to make an adjustment to that. The character went through an evolution that I thought was kind of cool. Now he eventually gets his adamantium back because Apocalypse puts it back on him. So that's how he gets it back. But it was a journey, and I remember I purchased this out of a army post because I was still in basic training. I was in the dying days of my basic training, about to head off to Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. And this is when we, at the end of basic training, you can get out. You're no longer a caged prisoner. You can go out to places and buy stuff. And I remember this as being one of the things that I bought. Now I am going to go ahead and bring up these covers for all of these things were actually absolutely cool.
Now
John Romita did some covers. Had cool. Andy Kubert did some covers. I mean, these covers are amazing, and each one of them came with a hologram in the right midsection. And the most famous episode, I want to always call comic books episode, is going to be this one right there. For let me just make sure I got you. X-Men 25. I still have a couple of copies of it here. It's actually a pretty cheap book for what it was. You see, when you see the cover, you don't know exactly what's going to happen to them. And back in '93, you didn't have everything spoiled for you until you read the issue. This was a storyline, and I'll go ahead and give you the synopsis that Marvel gives you for this storyline. This is the Andy Kubert's cover, and this is the issue where Wolverine gets the adamantium taken out. All right, and this introduced a lot of different elements that would keep and this was actually later than 1991, by the way. Let's see. So Fatal Attraction. Magneto returns more powerful than ever, and Professor X realizes it's time for their decades-long conflict to end permanently. Professor X and Magneto square off against each other aboard Asteroid M at Avalon. After Magneto strips Wolverine of his adamantium, Professor X destroys Magneto's mind. Colossus stays behind to care for Magneto since he's now defected to the Acolytes. And the Acolytes were a group of like the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And this was the time in Colossus's development to where he had just lost his sister to the legacy virus. So all the peace and happiness and non belligerent acts that malevolent acts that Professor X had been teaching his students, Colossus was at a point in his life where he was doubting all that. And Magneto, as a character, has never been written. The only storyline, in my opinion, where Magneto was written better was in Age of Apocalypse, an alternate universe. This is the best Magneto storyline ever. The dialogue between in all these issues, and you had several issues. The core issues of it are X Factor 92, X Force 25, X-Men 25, Uncanny X-Men 304, and Wolverine number 75. These are out of order because Wolverine 75 takes place right after X-Men 25, and X-Men Uncanny X-Men 304 actually is part one of it. This is when Magneto comes down to the X Mansion and Colossus actually leaves with him. It starts off with Atlanta Rasputin Magic, her funeral. And this is where Colossus starts to doubt Professor X's teachings. And the conversations with Professor X and him going back and forth all the way through this is great. And the whole entire storyline is about who's right and who's wrong as far as their vision for mutant kind. And they wrote it in a way to where, yeah, Magneto's a super villain who's done horrible things. This is a storyline that they did the best. and showing you things from his point of view. And they used Colossus's sister dying and basically saying, these people who taught you all this happiness stuff, they failed you. They couldn't save your sister. They put your sister, they are allowing the Sentinel program that they were making, that's what started the whole thing, to be, this is something that we could have destroyed. All these things that harm mutant kind, I can protect you from. Magneto became a cult of personality, and he was at the height of his powers. So, but it wasn't just about him being able to do things with magnetism. This was about him using his point of view to convince people to come over. And the reader actually had a legitimate decision to make, and then towards the end, Magneto's just, he's so committed to this mission that what causes Wolverine to attack him, that leads to the whole Adamantium being wrote down, is Quicksilver goes after Magneto. Now, Quicksilver, for those of you who are not Marvel heads and don't know, that's
Magneto's son.
Magneto's son. And he struck Quicksilver with a blow that could have killed him. And Wolverine, I remember the quote saying, any guy who would take out his own son's off his rocker, and he went after him. And then that's when Magneto, who had a lot of respect for Wolverine, but both, and there's another sense about this storyline. Both Magneto and Professor X felt this was the end. When you read it, you understand that this is a final confrontation between the two. That of all the battles that they had, there's been too much damage. One side has to win for one of the points of view to carry on. And Magneto was at that point, and he was written masterfully here, where he's willing to go that step. The mission he was on was more important than his son, more important because there was a time when he and the X-Men were allies. At a point, and he's seen so much death, Genosha, all these things have happened to mutant kind, and here are the X-Men, and people are like, and they're X-Men, they're like, you know what, he's got a point, and that's the struggle you're in with the storyline. So each of these covers had these holographic things on them. This was at the beginning when it wasn't being ran into the ground. So
with everything you're saying there, it's like one thing I kind of asked. Do you think that this could be like? I mean, it is centered specifically on the X-Men. It's not the entire Marvel universe, but do you think that this could be considered almost like a forerunner to Civil War?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Good question. Yes and no. Yes, because there's conflicts amongst people that were not, that were comrades. Yes. Yep. The difference between Civil War and this is how it comes about. Now, you had a legitimate point when it comes to Tony Stark being on the government side because of the damage and everything else, and America, the public needed to be filled safely. But you also had a legitimate argument on Captain America's side that we're putting us in danger by putting this in the hands of people that we have fought that are corrupt. And, so you had a difference of philosophy there. That was a difference of philosophy that came about because certain things had happened. Like when you had the thing that with the new what's the group that the kid that exploded and killed everybody, and that's what started it all.
Why is his name escaping
me? Not
me?
Speedball. But the other, he was with Speedball. It's the new Forcer. Hold on. You guys will know it in the chat. He blew up and he killed a whole bunch of people. And that's what started the whole thing. Civil War. This is so old. It's 2006. All right. Let's see. Plot. The new
Nitro
blew up. So it was an incident that aggravated it. And you had something with the mutant registration stuff earlier on that kind of started it, but it was an incident. Were it not for that incident, you might not have had them get pushed that level. Whereas with Fatal Attraction, this is I forgot what anniversary X-Men was on, but they made it that they highlighted the anniversary, and this has been an entire existence-long struggle of the X-Men. Ever since Magneto was introduced, from the base villain that he was in X-Men #1, each time you saw him, he made the case. He made the case that what he was doing was for the protection of mutant kind, and it was always always parallel because Eric Lershner was Jewish. Eric Lershner was a Holocaust survivor. And so his argument was like, Charles, you're basically like Chamberlain. Why can't I think today? Prime Minister of Britain during World War II before Winston Churchill, Neville Chamberlain.
Yeah.
You're Neville Chamberlain while our people are dying. Our people are in camps. And when you look at the storylines, mutant internment camps and things like that, those were the X-Men writers over the decades trying to juxtapose that over that without doing it. But they were. That was when you see the camps and the alternate universe and the alternate universe that Rachel Summers comes from, where they get the mutants on a leash, things like that. That was what Magneto was always telling you that could happen. And his argument from day one always had merit. His methods sucked, though.
Yeah.
Magneto was willing to kill lots of people to save mutant kind. And that's where he ran up against the philosophy of Professor X. Now, when you look at it, what Stan Lee and Kirby and all those guys were doing back then is they were watching the civil rights struggle unfold, where you had Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Now, both arguments, as somebody of color, I can relate to both arguments, because when you're watching things go on in the South in the civil rights movement, you're watching people get shot, burned, and hung, and then you're thinking, how can I survive this by being peaceful? How can I? And that's a legitimate argument that Malcolm X made. But the other argument, which was just as valid, was Martin Luther King's argument, is that we need to be peaceful and we need to get legislation passed. So they were making that argument. So by the time you got to Fatal Attractions, the argument had cemented in to the point where it starts to affect both sides. Magneto's argument, because of the legacy virus, because of the mutant massacre, because of everything that has victimized mutant kind, Magneto's argument has grown to its strongest point. So whereas Civil War, it was an incident that catapulted it, that triggered it. With this, it was a gradual entire existence of mutant kind in comic books that this led to. And it was brilliantly, and you felt that when you read it. You felt that you were not just reading 4 or 5 issues of a comic book. You felt that at wherever point you jumped into X-Men, the comic, and you jumped into the storyline, that you were feeling the weight of the entire struggle of mutant kind. And it culminated in dramatically in that. That's why I love this story. That's why I think it's a turning point. Also, one of the biggest things that came out of this, and not the best thing that came out of it, was Onslaught. Because Magneto, after he does what he does to Wolverine, Professor X, the most powerful telepath in the world at that time, basically reaches into Magneto's mind and shuts him down. Seconds after he does that to Wolverine. And this is something he could have always done. And that's what I mean about the finality of the storyline. This was something that he could always done. Magneto could have always done the things that he did to them. And Professor X could have always shut down Magnus or Eric. That's because they were friends to that point. And when this story escalates to that point of no return, Magneto reached the point of no, and if you read the dialogue as he does this, he's quoting like Shakespeare. It's the most brilliant. I'd read it to you, but it's long. But as he's pulling Wolverine's adamantium out, he's quoting scripture and Shakespeare. So he knows he knows what he's about to do is going to bring him to a turning.
It's the nuclear option.
Yeah, but he believes that just like dropping a nuclear bomb, that he's doing it in this war. Whereas Professor X is like, I don't want to do this, but this is where you bought me. And he literally shuts him down. Now, the after effects are like that, and they would tell you 3 years later in the old Onslaught story when X, the whole X-Trader thing that Bishop came back and was telling everybody about for 7 years because he came in 1991. That ended up being Professor X, because as a byproduct of going into Magneto's mind, he formed a composite conscious that will become Onslaught, and now with the composite powers of Professor X and Magneto. And then the whole Heroes Reborn thing that fucked up comics. But we'll get into that probably never. I will probably never cover Heroes Reborn. Ugh. Google it.
Is that like the comics equivalent to Howard the Duck for you?
It was a bad time in comics in general, because that's when Marvel and everybody was so desperate then. That's when they brought in Layfield and Jim Lee, and basically the creators of Image took over. They all of the comic people, all the Fantastic Four. Franklin Richards created this portal to where he turned them on the energy. I forgot the end of the storyline, and that's how they beat Onslaught. but they did it by just, wiping out their universe and creating a new one. And then like Rob Liefeld was doing Captain America, it was for a while, and then it switched back, and then you had the amalgam stuff and all that. This was back in the mid 90s, from 1990 maybe 7 to about 2002, 3. Some of the worst comics put out, in my opinion. There were some gems in there, but the comic book industry had gotten so saturated with chromium covers, with overprinting. That was a real thing that killed us, was overprinting, because I was open then. And like I always say, when you started printing so many things, that I got as much of many of these in Black Superman covers as I do toilet paper. That is when the value started going down, and once you bring down the value, there's no trade value. And if there's no trade value, we're not getting things in that we can sell and circulate. We're existing completely on the first market stuff that came out. And that in the mid 90s, that's not how the way comic book stores work. You had people bringing in stuff to sell you, trade and stuff like that, and you turned those into equitable things that you could sell and you could mark up. That wasn't happening because there was not enough value out there, and there was just too many books. The print run on these books jumped. Like Spider-Man's print run jumped, X-Men's print run jumped. And like I said, you had storylines that took place in the early 90s in Infinity Gauntlet, Infinity War, 30-part storylines that just saturated the market. And this is the Fatal Attractions of Age of Apocalypse and stories like that were in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, the last vestiges of really good connected storytelling, where they weren't writing the story to be desperate. After this, in the mid 90s, man, like those people who were on drugs in the 60s and can't remember like Woodstock or any of that stuff. To me, that's the mid to late 90s. I just want to forget it ever happened. So, but that is our Turning Point story, and it's a good one. Please read this one, guys. This story, even though I know Hickman's done his thing and there's been different things, this is a great story no matter how long you've been with collecting comics, because like I said, it sheds light on the entire existence of mutant kind. So there you go. This week's Turning Point story, X-Men Fatal Attractions. Go get it. And I have some issues here if you're ever in Vegas.